so those are some things that are kind of cool about arrays that make them just like objects. And we were just talking about this loop, this for-in loop, that we can use with objects. And if an array is an object, shouldn't it work? What are our predictions? Is that a prediction? No. OK. I'll get to you in a second. What's your prediction? What about, let's see, what about Kevin? You have a prediction?
Log the values.
The values?
Yeah.
Or the property names?
The values.
The values. OK. So we have a guess for the values. What about Andy?
I think it's going to be the property names.
Property names?
If the rules don't change, it's property names.
Yep. So it's going to be the property names because the rules don't change. And if you don't believe me, you can try it out. And the rules don't change. Check this out. Our 0th numerical index is actually a string. That's interesting, right? Cool. So the rules don't change. And we can do it. Oh, did you have a question, Mark? I'm sorry, I forgot.
Yeah, do you have the chat up? It might help just to look at the question a couple back now, but any difference between, and they have a few examples there.
So the question is there any difference between, here, I'll type it out here on the screen so everyone can see. Box 2, and then, so we have box.asdf equals true, and then box2.asdf equals false. I'm sorry, equals true. And it says, is there any difference here? And I'm going to argue, no, that there's no difference between how we're adding a property and a value to an array versus an object. I'm going to argue that that is exactly the same. Even though it's an array. Cool. So we have this loop. And this k is printing out, again, just the property names. So how would, if we wanted to get those values out, how would we do that again? What about Grace?
You would add the square brackets.
Absolutely. Cool. And so that's going to then log our values, which would be 9 and meow, right? Thumbs so far? Thumbs in the back? Thumbs? Cool. All right, what about this? What is this going to log? Anyone?
9 and meow.
The values.
The values? Good guess, but remember that whole variable dot notation rule? Remember that rule? Thumbs if you remember the rule. That you can't use dot notation with a variable. Thumbs? Thumbs? So since k is a variable, we can only use bracket notation. I'm just going back to this rule that we discussed earlier. So this is going to be actually undefined. Undefined, because k is a variable. And if we go back to that slide, the rules, all the way down, that for dots, we can't use variables. For brackets, we can. Okay, so, cool. And we know, again, and we know k is a variable because we just see var here, right? For var, that means k is a variable. Cool. So this is how we would do it then. Here we have the bracket notation. Cool. Cool, so that's great. It behaves exactly the same as an object. Then how come we've never really noticed that before? Like when we loop, right, we don't really use the for-in loop because we're not really interested in, usually we're not, if we're using an array, we're usually not interested in those named properties. So even if we did have this size here, the size property. We're probably not too interested in it, and if we were, we'd probably choose to use just a vanilla object. So how are we going to loop? We're probably going to use a loop like this, right? Has everyone seen thumbs on this loop, this for loop with semicolons here? Cool. So this for loop with semicolons is pretty interesting. Remember when I said the for in loop was like a thing that was made specifically for objects? That's not true for this for in loop. This for in loop is just mathematical. If you look at it, all this, how you give directions to the for loop is in this signature right here. We have for and we have var I equals 0. So that's saying create a variable I, start at 0, and then it says loop while I is less than the length of our box, right? And then this one says increment I plus 1 every time. So every time we loop, we're going to increment I. And we can change that, you know. We can do plus equals 2 if we wanted. If you want to do every other one or every third one, right, you can change it. But I plus plus seems to be the norm. You can also count down, right, I minus minus. But the mechanics here is that they're just numbers, right? So if we console.log I, what is that logging?
0, 1, 2, 3. 0, 1, 2.
Yeah, 0, 1. We're going to get to the length property in a bit. But the point here is that I is just a number. Like, I doesn't know anything about our array. The only thing it knows about is this number here, box.length, which we could really just change to 2. And it would be equivalent. So there's no relationship between this loop and the array. It's just like mathematical directions. And so if we say increment until 2, it'll just console log 0 and 1. Thumbs on that? Cool. What about this? Actually,
I have a question.
Sure.
So, why is length 2 and not 3?
We're going to get to that in just a second.
Oh.
Yeah. Let's just do this. So, if we wanted to access the value, could we do it this way? Oh.
It's a variable.
Yeah. I'm going to drill this into you until everyone like hates me for it. So here we have, again, just our bracket notation with the variable. And maybe we're starting to see that I is just a variable, and we have to use the bracket notation only because it's a variable, not because the array is an array and there's some special syntax surrounding it. It's simply because it's a variable. And also, if we go back here to box at 0, for numbers, remember, numbers we always have to use the bracket notation. And that's why you tend to see bracket notation with arrays, because we tend to use them for their numerical indices, and bracket notation just makes sense.
So when I loop through that, my output is meow and then woohoo. So what index is the size, or is the value 9 at?
Yeah, so if you look down here, you can see, kind of think of it this way. So we have 0, we have 1, and then we have size. It's not at an index. It's just a property on the object.
Oh, it's a property.
Yeah. And so since we're looping until 2, and I is a number, it's just going to be, and I, remember, is going to be 0, 1, so it's going to say box at 0, right, which is meow. You can look at it, think of it like this too. Or box at 1, which is going to be woohoo, because we push that on to the end, right? And so we see we have this property 1 with the value woohoo. Does that make sense?
And we have I attribute size with the value.
And then we have size, which we don't touch, right? Because I is just a number. All right, can I have one question from the audience?
Why would we use arrays instead of objects when it's pretty much the same thing?
So why would we use arrays instead of objects? Because arrays have methods on them that deal with order, and you can sort them, you can slice them in ways that you can't do for an object. Objects are better for other things like quick lookups, or having data with like that is categorized. Like if you had like a user, just like your animal user, it has different categories on it. You know, you have a username, then there's a value there, and you have like maybe an age, and then it has a value. Versus an array, if you try to represent a user data as an array, like so the name and then the age, it's hard to keep track. You'd have to keep track of like the index, kind of, like if you're using an array in a traditional way.
Aren't typically, I guess it depends on the browser, but iterating over an array is faster. Is that true?
You know, I'm not sure. I haven't tested
like,
that.
well, there's like a little test thing I found, and I mean, in my browser, it is by like quite a bit actually. So
Interesting.
I don't know if that's true. I guess it depends on the browser and how they implemented their engine or whatever. But
Yeah, that kind of makes sense to me. Cool.
So what is the length then?
Let's see. How many? I'm almost there.
Oh, okay.
Okay, wait. Actually, I'm there. We're covering this. So the cool thing. So I'll just jump into this unless we have any more questions about iteration. Sure.
I think this might be, if they're answering, but so they're a couple seconds behind, just so you know. But
Okay.
so if I is less than 3, it still wouldn't print size.
True.
Okay.
True. Because the reason is it would just. So if we just change this to 3 here, what it would print would be meow, you know, woohoo, and then undefined. Because what it's going to do once it gets to the index 2, so once I is 2, it'll say box at 2, and it will do a lookup at our box, and we don't have a property at 2, right? We only have a 0, we have a 1, and then we have a string size. So it's never going to return size in this loop. And this is a loop we tend to use because, again, when we're using an array, we're not usually using it to have numbered string properties that are characters like size, for example.
So in the console, I did a box, and I put a size, like you have size 9, and then I have 0 in quotes and 1 in quotes, and when I just hit box, the size part doesn't come out.
True. So the console like just prints what it depends on which console you're using and the version of Chrome and all that, but for example, I have 3 undefineds. Let's see. So we have box. Oh, that's because this needs to be I. Cool. So if we look at box, it appears just to have 2 things. But if you console.log box, sometimes you can see it. Let's see. So size is there. It's just not a numerical index. And your console probably isn't going to pay attention to it because it's assuming that you are only worried about the numerical indices. And it's really up to whoever is designing the console to what it's showing and what it's not showing, because really under the hood, there's a lot of different methods and properties on everything, especially like natively, that it's just not going to print out.
And same thing with length. It's like length of 2 when I just hit. Not when I do console log that, but.
Do you have a question?
They just want you to verify that arrays stay ordered and objects don't.
So the arrays are only ordered because of the numbers. Because it starts from 0 and it counts up. That's why there's order. There's nothing like magical happening that like is keeping track of the order. It's just the numbers.
So that second line box, square bracket size equals 9.
Mm-hmm.
There's no way to get that value out by using indexing with integers.
True. True, because the only way you can get the value 9 out is by looking it up by the property name, which is size, which is not number, right?
So arrays can be accessed by index number as well as property names?
Yep. So here I am using dot notation, box.size, box bracket size, right? If we look at box, and then we have our numerical indices as well, right? We have meow, and we also have woohoo.
Isn't it better to say arrays can have properties and
That-
I'm not sure.
Is box an object that has an array as a property, or is it an array that has a
Object array.
size attribute?
Box is an object. It's an array, but an array is also an object. So it's both an array and an object. And the thing that's special about arrays is not really the numerical indices. It's really the properties and the methods that come with it. So that dot length property is something that makes arrays different. And based on the dot length property, you can calculate a lot of things. So as long as the array, so if you have an object that's keeping track of the length, and then you have the methods, the array methods, that are working off of the length, then you have an array. So you can create your own array just by having that magical length property that's keeping track of the length. And so how the length property works, it's only going to keep track of the highest numerical indices. So it's going to ignore size, it's going to ignore itself, like length itself is a property, right? See, we have this dot notation, box.length. You know, it's not counting that. It's not counting box.push, you know, pop, things like that. So it's only going to be keeping track of those numerical indices, and based on the length and the numerical indices, those methods can do cool things with the data that we have stored in this array / object.
So if box is an object, then length would be 3. Is that right?
Well, objects don't have a length property.
Oh.
Yeah.
So because arrays are objects, let's say you have an empty array and you're assigning meow to the first index.
Mm-hmm.
Behind the scenes, does it add a property called 0 and then the value called meow or whatever you're assigning to it?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a perfect way to think of it, and that's kind of why I draw it like this. You can kind of see, this is kind of how I think about it, is it's just an object, and it has these properties on it, and then it has the length property and a bunch of methods that give us some powerful functionality. Like we can sort things, we can reverse it, slice, all those things that you can't do with an object. Yeah.
So when you're console logging, you're actually logging the object.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why it shows the size.
And that's why we can use this other for loop. Remember the for in loop will work with box even if it's an array, and that's because it's an object.
In that case, you do pick up size.
Yes, in that case you do, because it's just going to be looping through all of the property names. That includes numerical properties as well as named string properties. Yeah. Oops. Cool. You had a question?
There's a question on why you would want to add a property to an array.
For different reasons. This will. It depends. You can add like methods to it, to the prototype and things. That will add. You can extend functionality that way. You can. I don't know. Mm-hmm.
And then, I guess, following up on that, another question. So if I have an object with an attribute called length, push, pop, etc., it will be an array?
Yeah, so if the length property is keeping track of the numerical indices, every time you add something to it, then yes.
If you use object notation and you add those properties to it, it's not gonna make it an array.
But you can mimic array functionality.
You have to build that all into your.
Well, that's what he was saying. If you do build it out, they're both objects.
Right.
One's native,
Right.
one's not.
The only hard part would be keeping track of the numerical. So you'd have to have some way to know whenever you're adding a property to the object, so that you could adjust the length property. So you'd have to
Going
use like
back
a
to
getter or
just
setter or something.
Adding the length property, that doesn't make it an array. You're not gonna pick up automatically then pop, push, slice,
Well,
split.
you have to build all that
You
out.
have to build all that out to pick up all that,
Yeah.
that functionality.
Right. It's a little more complicated, but yeah. Cool. Sweet. All right. What about this? What's this gonna log? So it's even gonna work?
Nope.
Why?
Because length is in quotes. Just looking for that.
Because length is in quotes? What is length? So length in quotes, again, remember it's the same as dot notation. Right? True? Length in quotes the same as dot notation. Thumbs on that? Cool. So the length is 4. Right? And that goes, again, to like how length is working. So length is keeping track of the last index. It's not keeping track of like the number of actual values in the array. Mm-hmm.
They wanted me to ask you, in theory, you could get away with never using dot notation and only using bracket notation.
True. You could only use bracket notation. It's just more to type. Cool. What about this? What if I change this? Undefined, because length does not have quotes around it.
That's tricky. That's not fair.
I know. You guys should just know that I'm tricking you the whole time. And look out for that. And think about those rules. And as you're coding, you should be actively thinking about the rules. Is this, series of characters, is this a string? Is this a variable? Is it an expression that needs to be evaluated? You should always be thinking that and keeping track of what it is. And then if it is a variable, you should also be keeping track of what that variable can represent in different scenarios all the time. Can't just take it for granted.
Bianca, can you go back one slide again?
Sure.
What did you say at the very tail end of this explanation? You said it only looks at the last.
Yeah, so it looks at the last, or the highest numeric index, and then it adds 1. Because the length is always +1.
Because it's 0 based.
Because it's 0 based, absolutely.
Okay, that's weird.
That's programming. Yeah. Yeah, when I tell some of my students, you're my number 0 student. Let's see. So we did that one, and then here. So what if we wanted to find the last? We wanted to look at the last index of our array.
Minus 1.
Like this?
The length. Just minus 1.
Actually, that only works with slice. You're thinking of slice. So box.length -1, totally. So box.length, right, is going to be 4, and then our last index is 3, as we can see here. So we need to subtract 1. And back to the thing about the bracket notation, being able to evaluate expressions. This is a perfect example of when you'd want to do that. So here we're doing a property lookup and we're doing math. So all those things are happening, and those are things that you cannot do in dot notation. And it just looks weird, right? Like, look at this. Right, this just doesn't look right.